Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the True Stories collection, and it's a very important interaction to know if you play Modern, because the deck involved in these cards actually happens to be very popular right now. Amy plays a Cultivator Colossus, and she puts into play a Valakut, and after that, she puts into play a Vesuva. Is it possible for Amy to have the Vesuva become a copy of the Valakut after it enters the battlefield? Alright, so before we take a look at the question originally presented, I want to take a look at a related question that comes up quite a lot also. I think it's probably pretty well known that if you play a Primeval Titan and you get Vesuva and some other land, then it is not possible for you to have the Vesuva enter the battlefield as a copy of the other land that's entering at the same time as it. And why is that? The reason is because the thing that makes you copy a land with the Vesuva is a replacement effect. And replacement effects have this quirk that they apply immediately before the event that they're replacing. So in this case, the event that we're replacing is the event of Vesuva entering the battlefield. And we're going to replace that with a completely different event, with the Vesuva entering the battlefield as a copy of a different land and also tapped. So immediately before the event that the Vesuva replacement effect is replacing, that is before the Vesuva enters the battlefield, then we would have to apply that replacement effect. And when we apply the replacement effect is when we choose what land that we're going to copy. Of course, since the Vesuva is not on the battlefield yet at this point, that means the other land, which is entering at the same time as it, is also not on the battlefield at this point, which means it would not be valid for you to choose that land with the Vesuva to be copied. Now that we've got that one straightened out, let's take another look at the original question presented in the problem statement at the beginning of the episode. With the Cultivator Colossus, we can see that it's worded a little bit differently from the Primeval Titan. In particular, whereas the Primeval Titan just says to take two lands and put them both onto the battlefield, putting them on at the same time, the Cultivator Colossus actually works a little bit differently. The Cultivator Colossus says you put a land onto the battlefield and draw a card, then you repeat that process. So after you put the first land, then you would put in another land, and then you'd put a third land, and so on. Because the Cultivator Colossus does not put all of the lands into play at the same time, but rather in part of a specifically ordered sequence, that means that the Vesuva is going to enter the battlefield in some part of that sequence. This means that the Vesuva would be able to become a copy of any land that was on the battlefield at the time when the Vesuva entered, including any land that came into play at any point before it in that sequence. You would not be able to have the Vesuva enter the battlefield as a copy of any land that came into play after it, because the point where you determine what land the Vesuva is copying is the point immediately before the Vesuva enters the battlefield. So therefore, any lands that enter the battlefield after the Vesuva would not be eligible. However, any land that does enter the battlefield before the Vesuva in the Cultivator Colossus' resolution, well, that land would be fair game for you to copy. Now that we've got that question sorted, let's take another look at a very important question to know regarding how Cultivator Colossus' ability works. Let's say that we already have 7 lands and a Druid of Ilysian Grove on the battlefield, and we're going to play the Cultivator Colossus. Let's say we're going to put into play a Simic Growth Chamber, and then a Valakut, and then a Forest. What will happen? And in order to answer this question, we're going to need to know a little bit about how triggered abilities interact with the Cultivator Colossus. We already talked about replacement effects in the previous section, but now we have stuff that has triggered abilities. That is, abilities that use the word at, when, or whenever. Now, the important thing about triggered abilities is that immediately after anything happens in the game has to decide whether any triggered abilities have triggered. And it takes all the triggered abilities that have triggered and it writes them down on a whiteboard. Here's the important part for this question though. It doesn't put those triggered abilities from the whiteboard right onto the stack right away. Rather, the game waits until the next time that a player would get priority, and that's when it takes all of the triggered abilities that have been written on the whiteboard and it puts those triggered abilities onto the stack at that time. So let's take a look at how that would apply to the case that was described just now. So the first land that we said we were putting into play with Cultivator Colossus would be a Simic Growth Chamber. So when that enters the battlefield, immediately after that happens, the game has to check to see if any triggered abilities have triggered. Now of course, the Simic Growth Chamber has a triggered ability on it that says when this enters the battlefield, then you return a land to your hand. And so that's exactly what we see happening. The game is going to therefore take that triggered ability and write it on the whiteboard. Remember, we're not putting it on the stack just yet, so Amy doesn't return the land at that point. Rather, she's going to wait until the next time a player would get priority. Okay, so with that being the case, she's going to draw her card from the Cultivator Colossus, and then it's time to repeat that process. The next land that we said that we were putting onto the battlefield would be a Valakut, and so we're going to have that Valakut entering the battlefield. Let's notice that Valakut does not say any other mountain entering the battlefield should cause it to trigger. So that means that if there were some way that you could have the Valakut enter the battlefield as a mountain, which of course is exactly what's happening here because of the Druid of Ilysian Grove, well, that would mean that the Valakut's ability would be able to trigger off of itself entering the battlefield. So that's exactly what's going to happen. We said that Amy already had 7 lands when this started, so she definitely is going to control 5 other mountains. So that means that immediately after the Valakut enters the battlefield, the game is going to check to see if there's any triggered abilities that need to trigger, and what do you know, there is. So the game is going to write the Valakut deal 3 damage to any target ability on the whiteboard also. Okay, now, after that happens, Amy's going to draw her card from the Valakut, and then she's going to have a 3rd land that she puts into play. We said this was just going to be a normal forest. So immediately after the forest enters the battlefield, the game is going to check to see if that caused any triggered abilities to trigger. The Valakut is still in play at this point, so it's going to trigger from that happening. Let's notice that the Valakut triggered from itself and from the forest entering, but not from the Simic Growth Chamber, because the Valakut was not in play at the time when the Simic Growth Chamber entered the battlefield. So that means that the game did not see the land entering the battlefield for the Valakut triggered ability at the time when the Simic Growth Chamber entered the battlefield, since of course the Valakut was not in play yet. With that being the case, the game is going to put a second Valakut trigger onto the whiteboard immediately underneath the one that happened from the Valakut itself entering. So with that being the case, Amy should draw her 3rd card from the Cultivator Colossus, and now we are ready to end the resolution of the Cultivator Colossus's enters the battlefield ability. That means that we're finally ready to get to the point where a player is about to get priority. And so we're going to take all of the triggered abilities from the whiteboard and we're going to put them on the stack. Amy controls all of these triggered abilities, which means she's the one that gets to decide what order that they get put onto the stack. This doesn't necessarily have to be the order that they triggered. She can choose whatever order she wants. Now, that's not really going to be relevant for this specific situation because it doesn't really matter what order that these things happen in, but certainly this sort of thing could come up in a similar situation where this rule was also relevant. So Amy's going to put all those triggered abilities onto the stack, and only then is it going to be time for her to deal 3 damage to some stuff and return lands to her hand. So that's the way that those triggered abilities would be working if you had the Cultivator Colossus. The important takeaways here is that you don't get to return any lands to your hand with the bounce lands, or if you had, for example, an Amulet of Vigor, you wouldn't get to untap any of your lands because that's also a triggered ability. You wouldn't get to do any of that stuff until after you were completely done putting all of the lands into play with Cultivator Colossus and completely done with drawing all of the cards that you were drawing with Cultivator Colossus. So that's how the Cultivator Colossus's ability would work with lands entering the battlefield that cause triggered abilities to trigger. Are you ready for one last challenge question to test your understanding of the concepts that we introduced so far? Let's say that Amy controls 4 lands. For the purposes of this question, we're going to say that they're all forests. She also controls that same Druid of Ilysian Grove. Now, Amy is going to play a Cultivator Colossus, and she's going to use its ability to put into play 3 lands. That's going to be a Valakut, and then a Vesuva that she wants to copy Valakut with, and finally another forest. What is going to happen, and how many total 3 damage triggers is she going to get from this sequence of plays? So first of all, Amy's Valakut is going to enter the battlefield. Now, if you take a look at Valakut's triggered ability, you can see that it triggers if you control 5 other mountains. Because this is Amy's 5th land, that means she's not going to get any triggers at all from this happening. The next land that Amy puts into play is going to be the Vesuva, and we said that she was going to copy the Valakut with that Vesuva. We already talked a little bit earlier today about exactly why that is possible. So let's take a look at some of the repercussions of that. Immediately after the Vesuva/Valakut enters the battlefield, the game is going to check to see if there's any triggered abilities that need to happen. Now, we already said that the replacement effect from the Vesuva that makes it a copy of the other land is going to apply immediately before the Vesuva enters the battlefield. That means that there's no point in time at which the Vesuva is on the battlefield at which it is not a copy of the Valakut. That means that immediately after the Vesuva enters the battlefield, when the game is checking to see if there's any triggered abilities that need to trigger, the game is going to see that there are 2 instances of the Valakut 3 damage triggered ability that are applicable. There's going to be one from the original Valakut, and there's going to be one from the Vesuva that's copying it. Because Amy controls 6 lands now, that means that each of these is going to see that she does indeed control 5 other mountains. And so that means that both of these triggered abilities are going to be considered triggered. And that means they're both going to be written on the whiteboard. Remember, we're not going to do anything with that quite yet, because we wait until after all of the steps for the Cultivator Colossus' ability have finished before we put any of the triggered abilities that trigger during that process onto the stack. Okay, so the third land that Amy puts into play is going to enter the battlefield now. And Amy is going to see that it's also a mountain because of the Dryad's ability. That means that when the game checks to see if there's any triggered abilities that need to trigger, the game is going to once again see that she does control 5 other mountains, and that means that both instances of the Valakut triggered ability, the one from the original Valakut and the one from the Vesuva copying it, are both going to trigger from that event and both going to be put on the whiteboard. After Amy has drawn her card, that means that the whole ability of the Cultivator Colossus has finished resolving, and Amy is good to get priority, which means that she's going to be putting all those abilities we just talked about onto the stack, 4 in total. That's kind of interesting because it works a little bit differently from another ruling that you might be familiar with. Again, this is another really popular one that happened a lot back in the day when Scapeshift was a very popular deck. You might already know that if you play a Scapeshift while you control Druid of Ilysian Grove and you put into play 6 lands with some Valakuts and some other lands, then immediately after that happens, the game is going to check to see if any triggered abilities have triggered. Because you control 6 lands, then all of the Valakuts are going to see that you control 5 other mountains for each of the lands that's entered the battlefield. And that's generally going to lead to a lot of triggering. Let's notice that because the Scapeshift puts all of the lands in play at the same time, that is going to cause a little bit of a different interaction with the Valakut than what we saw with the Cultivator Colossus interaction. Where with the Cultivator Colossus, we put the lands into play in a sequence, which means that any lands that got put into the sequence before Amy controlled a total of 6 lands are not going to cause any Valakut triggers because the requisite number of lands is not in play yet. However, the 6th and subsequent ones are going to cause a triggered ability. If you contrast that with how the triggered abilities from Valakut work with the Scapeshift example, it works a little bit differently, and again, that's that same sort of phenomenon that we saw before with the Primeval Titan and the Valakut/Vesuva, because we were putting all those lands into play at the same time. Cultivator Colossus, therefore, has some really kind of interesting interactions that throw a lot of people off, because most of the interactions are very similar to ones that they might be familiar with other cards. Unfortunately, because the Cultivator Colossus is a little bit unusual in that it puts the lands in play in a defined sequence rather than all at once, then that leads to some differences in the answers. Hopefully, with all the information that was presented here, you should be able to walk through all the complexity and deliver these rulings with confidence. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.